morning. John said to Peter, "It's the Lord." Faces are endlessly fascinating. Usually it's other people's faces, although this week I watched with a certain interest as the black eye appeared after my accident and developed nicely through the week in a wide variety of shades of brown and green, the sorts of things that I think no makeup could possibly imitate. But assuming that most of us don't spend too long gazing in the mirror, it's other people's faces that capture our attention. And it is so from our earliest days. Babies are predisposed to focus on faces. That's why they need the attention of adults. And it's just as well that we find babies so adorable to look at, because while we're cooing away at them, their brains are busily processing the distinguishing marks of faces, human faces, preparing them for a life that's focused on people, not just on limbs and bodies, but primarily upon other people's faces. Faces which show by the tiniest change of muscle movements, the inward emotions, the feelings and the thoughts. In our faces is written, if you like, something of our souls. Eyes may not be in any simplistic way the windows of the soul, but so often in our eyes are written our deepest thoughts and our feelings. And because faces tell us so much, people have been endlessly curious about the face of Christ. That's why there's been so much interest in the Turin Shroud. Does it, people wonder, really show us the outlines of his face? The answer is almost certainly not, but what difference would it make, even if it did? Also in Christian history, we have the legend of the Veronica, a cloth associated with St. Veronica, supposedly a woman of Jerusalem, who used the piece of material, supposedly, to wipe the face of Jesus as he walked to the cross. And the legend claims that on that cloth are imprinted the features of his face. And of course here there's a play on words, for the name Veronica applied to the cloth can be understood to be derived from the word verus iconicus, meaning a true image. As the true icon, supposedly, the image of Christ, it had of course then miraculous properties, so that a picture painted from it supposedly effected a miraculous cure of the Emperor Tiberius. Well, that story of St. Veronica is a late medieval legend. It's got nothing reliable to tell us about Jesus. But it does tell us a lot about our desire to find the face, to look at the features through which God chose to disclose himself to the world. And such a desire would seem to take us into worlds that belong to other traditions of the Christian church, worlds of icons, of religious statues and paintings, and of sanctuaries that are beautifully and ornately decorated. I know that there are some people in our United Reformed churches who hanker after such things and who look enviously at the glorious images to be found in Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox churches. But in fact, our Reformed tradition, resolutely biblical here as usual, is quite correct. For all those images are at best unnecessary, and at worst they are distractions in our worship of God. For what we seek are not the features of the face, the outward signs. What we seek are the reality that they represent. We want to know Christ not by his outward appearance, but by his character, by his heart, and supremely by his grace and his love. And those key elements are shown to us best with least distractions, not in images, but in his word and in his spirit. For us, recognizing the face of Christ is not about seeing with our eyes the lines of a face, it's about receiving into our hearts what the outward features are at best merely the signs of, that is to say, the presence of his spirit. Our gospel reading for today is about the recognition of Jesus, an outward but also an inward recognition. Since his resurrection from the dead, the Gospels tell us Jesus has been recognized by his disciples in many ways. So outside the tomb, Mary recognized Jesus first by his voice. He called her name. He said, Mary, and she knew instantly that it was the Lord. And then at supper at Emmaus, Cleopas and his friend recognized Jesus by his actions, perhaps by the sight of his hands also, as he broke the bread for them. And Thomas was convinced by the sight and presumably the touch of the wounds. Jesus stood before him and said, put your finger here and see my hands, and put out your hand and place it in my side. Do not be faithless, but believing. And Thomas, utterly convinced by the evidence, responded, my Lord and my God. These recognitions are just a few of the many convincing proofs that Jesus showed his disciples in the 40 days between Easter and Ascension. Today we read about a recognition of Jesus that is by his appearance, by his features, seen from a distance as the dawn breaks. One disciple recognizes Jesus first, the others later on. So our initial theme, as we look at this story, is the recognition of Jesus. But another theme will be the recognition of ourselves as we look at the disciples, the first followers of Jesus. So let's think through this story. It's a strange time for the disciples when they know that Jesus really is risen from the dead, but he's not with them in the way that he was previously. Before the crucifixion, he was with them constantly. Now in his transformed state, he comes and he goes. They never know when to expect him next, and they do not know what to do while they're waiting for him. The disciples have now, in obedience to our Lord's command, gone back to Galilee. And our story begins with a group of the disciples sitting by the lake one evening. There's Peter, Thomas, no longer doubting. There's Nathaniel, James and John, and there are two other disciples. One of them, and not, I'm inclined to think, John, the son of Zebedee, is the one described in this story, as elsewhere in the Gospel, as the disciple whom Jesus loved, who is generally understood to be the author of the Gospel, John the Evangelist. And we have here some interesting characters sitting around on the beach there. We know a little bit about Thomas, he who had said bravely when Jesus decided to go to Jerusalem, a dangerous place to bring Lazarus back to life, Thomas had said bravely, let's go with him, that we may die with him. Thomas, who also asked the question of Jesus as they sat talking at the Last Supper, Lord, we don't know where you are going, so how can we know the way? Drawing from Jesus the most beautiful reply, John chapter 14, verse 6, should be etched in our minds. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except by me. And Thomas, of course, as we mentioned, who was so gutted by the crucifixion, he refused to meet with the disciples on the first Easter day, and so missed Jesus, and who refused to believe until a week later, Jesus stood before him and said, look, see, touch my wounds. It really, really is me. Thomas is an interesting character, but for today I want us to reflect on Peter and John, for they are such opposites. If you remember the Easter Day story, as described in the Gospel according to John, when Mary Magdalene tells the disciples that the tomb is empty, Peter and John run to see. Now, to understand this story, you have to imagine, I think, that Peter is the older man. We know for sure that he's married. I suspect maybe he has grown-up children, and I reckon he's in his early 40s perhaps, and he's showing some signs of middle age. Not least, he's put on a few pounds maybe around the waist, as most of us do as we go on a little bit. And on the other hand, John is the younger man. John is perhaps still in his teens. He's a fast runner. So the story tells us they both ran to the tomb. But John got there first, no surprise. But, and here is a difference of character, not a difference of age, John does not go in. John pauses outside, he looks in, he sees, and he's thinking, and he begins to understand, but he's still waiting outside. Peter, on the other hand, puffing and panting like a steam train, has no such hesitation. He runs up to the tomb and he runs straight in. We have two quite distinct characters here. John is the quieter, the more reflective. John is the sort of person who stands back and watches, the one who thinks and understands, and this is all in keeping with the character of the gospel account that he later writes. To use the characteristics from modern psychology, John is an introvert, and that may be why he's described as the disciple whom Jesus loved, because among that rough, tough bunch of exuberant fishermen and zealots and so on, John, and again I don't think that this is John the fisherman, the brother of James, this John needed some extra care and attention from Jesus if he was to survive. And if we were to chart John on a Myers-Briggs personality chart, he would be an introvert and he would be a perceiver, an I and a P rather than an E and a J. But Peter, on the other hand, Peter's an extrovert all the way. Peter is the one who rushes in both feet first without too much thinking. Sometimes he's wonderfully right and sometimes he's disastrously wrong. It's Peter who comes out with the great confession of faith, saying to Jesus, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And it's Peter who a second later tries to lead Jesus away from the path to the cross, and Jesus rebukes him very firmly for that. It's Peter who draws his sword when Jesus is arrested, who waves it around, and it's Peter also who denies Jesus 3 times. Peter is impulsive, decisive. He's usually brave, but above all, Peter is a doer. He's someone who gets stuck in. I suspect that in giving him the nickname Peter, the Rock, we have the clearest evidence of Jesus' sense of humour, because actually there's nothing very reliable or dependable or rock-like about Peter. He's not at all a safe pair of hands. Perhaps that's why he has become, in fact, the archetypal Christian hero whose weaknesses are as celebrated as his strengths, celebrated in Christian-inspired stories down to this day. So rather like his namesake in the Narnia stories, perhaps, or maybe as described in Chesterton's epic poem, "You and all the kind of Christ are ignorant and brave, and you have wars you hardly win, and souls you hardly save." It's rather nice. Our Christian heroes are not supermen. They have feet of clay, or rather we might say they have the defects of their qualities. Peter and John are complete contrasts. In our gospel story today, it's Peter who takes the initiative. Others may be happy to sit and think or talk quietly, reflecting on the events that have happened since Easter. But Peter can't bear just to sit around and do nothing. Peter has to be up and doing something, anything. So, for want of anything better, he says, "Let's go fishing." The other disciples agree, and so off they go. There are at least 3 experienced fishermen among that group. They know the lake like the back of their hand. They know how to catch fish, but not that night. That night they catch nothing. It must have been frustrating for them. By morning, we can imagine they were tired and hungry, and they were fed up. But then, just as day was breaking, a figure on the shore, about 100 yards away, calls out to them, "Have you caught any fish?" They could have been rather short with him, but they simply replied, "No." The stranger on the shore calls out again, "Cast your net on the right side of the boat, and you'll find some." The fisherman could have responded by saying, "And who do you think you are, telling us how to fish in this lake?" But though they do not know who the person on the beach is, they graciously do as they're told, and instantly the net is full. The sun is rising. The light is increasing second by second. Peter and John are gazing at the figure on the shore. Remember, Peter is the older of the 2, and as we get older, our eyesight deteriorates. No opticians or glasses back then. And no surprise then that it's John, the younger one, who sees more clearly. He recognizes the familiar lines of the face. He cries out, it's the Lord. John sees and he gazes in wonder. Peter does not see. That's a familiar theme in John's Gospel. But hearing John's exclamation, Peter grabs his cloak and he dives overboard. John is still looking, but Peter is already doing. He's doing the doggy paddle, let's imagine, those 100 yards to shore so that he can be with Jesus. Soon all the disciples are on the beach with Jesus. They can all see clearly now, and they have no doubt that it's the Lord. And he is there for them with a fire blazing and with bread and fish cooking. Come, says Jesus, come and have breakfast with me. Recognizing Jesus. John recognized Jesus, presumably from his physical appearance, making out the features as the light grew stronger, as the dark blur on the shore became clearer to the human eye. But for us, recognizing Jesus is not primarily about matching features. It's about discerning love. And for this, we don't need the Turin shroud or the Veronica. The characteristics of Jesus are not the shape of the face, but the character of the life, the person behind the face, as it were. Jesus in the story tells the disciples how their labors may bear fruit. Do it my way, he says, and see what a wonderful result there will be. And Jesus in this story nourishes his disciples, meeting their needs. Come, he says, come and have breakfast with me. And after breakfast, Jesus talks with Peter, recommissioning him after his failure, the denial of Jesus on the night of his arrest. And here is the grace of Jesus in action, taking the initiative in forgiveness and reconciliation. This is how we recognize Jesus, not by his body, but by his spirit. And if it seems likely, the author of the Gospel, John the Evangelist, being also the disciple whom Jesus loved, the character in the Gospel, is the same person as the author of the letters of John, later on in the New Testament, then we can see in those writings some guidance on the recognition of Jesus there also. What does John say? He who loves is born of God and knows God. He who does not love does not know God, because God is love. If we love one another, God abides in us, and his love is perfected in us. He who abides in love abides in God, and God abides in him, because God is love. We recognize the presence of God by his love. Our first duty is to recognize Jesus, to see him as the Messiah, the Son of the living God, the Saviour of the world, and to worship him as Lord and God. But our calling in Christ is also to recognize ourselves as his disciples, to see Christ in us as people called and equipped and prepared for service. And we're not always so very good at this. We too easily say, oh, if only I was like so-and-so over there, then I could be a really good Christian, with the implication that the way we are somehow condemns us to stand on the sidelines and let others get on with the really important work. Let's take an example. It's been estimated that the population is divided roughly equally between introverts and extroverts. Perhaps there are slightly more of the latter than the former. And the extroverts perhaps sit there and think, oh, if only I were quieter and more reflective. If only I thought more and talked less. If only I was not so impulsive. If only I wasn't so prone to make mistakes and to put my foot in it. If only I was a bit more like John in the Gospels, then God could really use me. Meanwhile, the introverts sit there and they think, oh, if only I had more confidence to get on and do things. If only I was more outgoing and sociable. If only I was more like Peter, then God could really use me. But the truth is that God chose, called, and used both Peter and John, and a whole range of human characters. Every type of person has a place in the company of the redeemed, the church militant, in the fellowship and work of the church. So wherever you are, if you happen to know, on the Myers-Briggs personality chart, you are there because God has made you like that for a purpose. In fact, he has work for you to do that no one else is qualified to do. God calls us just the way we are. Sin accepted, but God can deal with the sin. Whatever our personalities. And while we may not like what we see when we look in the mirror, and I don't just mean our physical features, but I mean the person beneath it, which our faces are just signs, we need to remember that God has made us as we are. God loves us just as we are, and God has work for us to do in his service, just as we are. Peter made so many mistakes, but the church needed a Peter to make things happen. The Peter who said, let's go fishing, didn't even sit around long enough to write out a gospel. He left that to Mark to record his memories. But Peter was a mover and a shaker. He travelled and he got things done. And yes, he continued to get things wrong, probably right to the very end. I think in this he's really rather like King David from the Old Testament. But he was, like David, a man after God's own heart. And God placed him at the heart of the Christian cause, the church. And John probably felt rather inadequate beside Peter. I expect he admired Peter's confidence and bullish manner, but he also saw clearly Peter's weaknesses, and they are laid out quite clearly for us in John's Gospel. We don't know the details, but I suspect that John didn't do much travelling. He wasn't very good as an itinerant evangelist. I suspect that he pastored the church, tradition says a church in Ephesus, until his dying day. Unless, of course, he's the same John who was exiled to the island of Patmos and wrote the book of Revelation, which I rather doubt. John wasn't one for novelty or excitement, rather he found these things inwardly as he reflected deeply on his experience of Jesus. And John probably felt he didn't achieve very much by comparison with some of the other disciples. He did not, like Peter and Paul, end up in Rome, or like Thomas, if legends are true, ending up in India. But of course, John's teaching, written in the Gospel and in the letters that bear his name, has been a priceless resource for the Christian church ever since. So, recognizing Jesus, perceiving the presence of God through his love and his grace, that is our first task. But also